wages and occupations, the labor market or unemployed, the economic penalties of being black at the same time that MME and MME Black Youth WM out of were lifting. A profound irony of the trends of the 60s was that growing numbers of blacks seemed to give up on getting ahead in the world, just as other blacks were demonstrating that it was finally possible to do so. The period from 1950 to 1980 saw major advances in black occupations relative to white occupations and in black wages relative to white wages. The part of the story we are about to examine is not an unqualified triumph, but it is decidedly positive. Occupational gains. One of the indispensable elements of the American dream is movement up the occupational ladder from common laborer to skilled worker, from blue-collar to white-collar, from white-collar to executive, if not in one's own life, then in the life of one's children. Much of the purpose of the affirmative action and equal employment regulations was to foster such mobility. It was observed that many blacks and other minorities were being shut out. Being black 1950 to 1980, of opportunities to which their abilities and training entitled them, and it was hoped that the right policy could open some of those doors. To obtain an overview of progress, let us first examine the general category of white-collar occupations. Figure 6.1 shows the racial breakdown for 1959 to 1980. During the years between 1959 and 1980, blacks made extraordinary progress in entering white-collar jobs, from only 14% of employed blacks in 1959 to 39% in 1980. Furthermore, the overall gap with whites narrowed substantially. In 1959, the ratio of whites to blacks in white-collar jobs was 3.2 to 1. In 1980, the ratio had fallen to 1.4 to 1. If in 1980 5 out of 10 whites wore white collars to work, so did 4 out of 10 blacks, many times the almost non-existent black white-collar class of the 1950s. Most of these gains came in two categories, professional and technical and clerical. The gain in managerial positions was proportionately large, but the absolute number of employed blacks in managerial positions remained small, and the gap between white and black remained very large, 5.2% of employed blacks compared with 12% of employed whites. We know from more detailed analyses that much of the progress in the 1970s was concentrated in the less prestigious jobs within each occupational category. Among professional and technical occupations, the bulk of increases occurred among jobs such as nursing, technical trades, and counseling, not among physicians and engineers and accountants. The new black members of the managerial class were much more likely to be found managing small businesses and service establishments than divisions of major corporations. Another factor that complicates simple conclusions is that much of the increase in white-collar jobs was owed to government jobs. Michael Brown and Stephen Erie concluded from their analysis that about 55% of the increase in black professional, managerial, and technical employment between 1960 and 1976 occurred in the public sector, and employment in social welfare programs accounted for approximately half of that increase. 3. Since most of the spending that created such jobs was concentrated at the end of that period, a graph of black professional employment in the private sector shows nearly the same upward slope in the 1950s and early 1960s that we observed in Figure 6.1, but much slower progress after the mid, in fact, very little progress at all. Blacks have not been integrated into the woof and warp of the American economy to the degree that the trend lines may suggest. But these are qualifications to a history that is otherwise highly positive. Blacks who sought entrance to the jobs that formerly had been the preserve of whites found increasing success, especially after 1960.4. Income of full-time workers. Employed blacks also made important gains in the struggle against wage discrimination. The overall picture for males is shown in Figure 6.2. The trend line shows the median income of year-round full-time workers, converted to constant $1,980. Income of black workers rose at roughly the same slope as income for white workers. The dollar gap fluctuated around $5,000 for the entire period, but the ratio of black income to white income improved, as shown for males in Figure 6.3. In 1955, the wage gap between black and white workers was $5,271. The typical black male worker was earning only 61% of the white worker's wage. In 1980, the gap was $4,993 but computed from a much higher real base, so that the black worker was earning 75% of the white worker's wage. It was a major improvement, practically as well as statistically. These data do not tell us much about racial disparities. Blacks gained wages and occupations. Yes, but we also know that black occupational patterns improved as well. Black income could have gone up relative to white income and still reflected a situation in which they received lower pay for the same work. To draw conclusions about wage differentials between whites and blacks, simple trend lines will not take us much further. We must examine the more detailed analyses using special databases or disaggregations of the published data to reach judgments about the state of affairs in black income and occupational gains. We may begin with a generalization. There is now a broad scholarly consensus that the gains in income parity are real and large among that subpopulation of blacks who obtained an education and stayed in the labor force. At the top of the ladder, the black-white discrepancy has shrunk to a few percentage points. By 1980, black males in professional and technical occupations were making 86% of the salary of their white counterparts. Black females made 98%. When additional factors are taken into account, differences in quality of education, years of experience, and so on, it may be that, for all practical purposes, the racial difference has disappeared for this one subgroup. Richard Freeman, a Harvard economist, argues that a detailed investigation of the National Longitudinal Survey shows that the occupational position of young black men entering the market after 1964 is essentially the same as that of young whites with similar backgrounds, a conclusion that finds additional support in the 1973 Occupational Change in a Generation survey. Members of the black elite entering the job market have achieved something very close to parity. This constitutes a major change. Historically, highly educated blacks were, relatively speaking, more discriminated against than blacks with less education. Statistically, this took the form of a gap between black and white incomes that increased as the educational level increased. Discrimination against the black intellectual elite also surfaced in such curiosities as Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., whose faculty in the 1930s and 1940s was said to have had the highest proportion of PhDs of any high school in the nation, black PhDs who were shut out of positions in white universities. This peculiar form of reverse discrimination, the more highly qualified you are, the more we will discriminate against you, was believed to exist into the late 1960s. Analysts continue to find that statistically, socioeconomically successful black parents were unable to transmit their success to their children to the same degree that white parents could. They also continue to find that, in the economist's phrase, black returns to education were lower, thus as late as 1972, when Christopher Jenks and Being Poor, Being Black, 1950 to 1980. His colleagues published Inequality. They cited 1961 data showing that employers paid relatively uneducated blacks in unskilled and semi-skilled jobs about 25% less income than comparable whites. Blacks with average amounts of education in middle-level jobs about 35% less than similar whites. Blacks in professional and managerial jobs may have been even more discriminated against. 9. The authors went on to hypothesize that one reason blacks remained at the bottom of the ladder was that the economic rewards of climbing were so slight. What changed this gloomy assessment? Largely, our understanding of what the data really meant. While it might be true that all blacks with an average amount of education in Jenks's 1961 data earned 35% less than all whites with an average amount of education, that did not mean that blacks who were just entering the job market were earning 35% less. Taking this factor into account changed the picture. In 1973, Phineas Welch published a pioneering article revealing that returns to education for blacks had achieved parity with whites in the 1950s and surged ahead in the early 1960s. The data he compiled revealed the following pattern. At some point between 1959 and 1962, blacks entering the labor force found a market in which their percentage increase in wages per unit of education was greater than that of whites. By 1965, the increase for blacks was more than half again as large the increase for whites. It was an indispensable step in closing wage gaps arising out of past discrimination. 12. The second group that made the most progress was black women, not just a highly educated elite, but women in a broad spectrum of occupations. Black women in all non-agricultural occupations had by 1980 effectively wiped out the racial discrepancy, which is to say, they were by then. Wages and occupations. No more underpaid relative to white males than were white women. From managerial positions to household workers, black women as of 1980 were earning as much as their white female counterparts. Of all non-farm categories, the lowest ratio of black-white women's wages was a high 94.3% for blue-collar operatives. In agriculture, the ratio was 81.4.13. Problems with wages and careers remain. Edward Lazier, among others, has argued that blacks unknowingly trade off higher initial wage levels for a flatter earnings profile in later career. Affirmative action programs have made it more difficult for employers to discriminate in wages, he suggests, and therefore employers decrease the more difficult to observe on-the-job training that is an important component of earnings. Lazier does not explore the rationales whereby employers are led to behave in this fashion. Recent studies indicate that simple racial discrimination seems to account for very little. But there are ample alternative explanations for why highly educated blacks start at excellent salaries, perhaps higher than those of their white peers, then find themselves with a truncated career path. Sometimes blacks are tokens, put in visible positions and then left there. Sometimes the phenomenon is more complex. In the occupation with which I am most familiar, for example, it is exceedingly difficult for a young black social scientist to follow a normal career path. He is hired as one of the senior staff for a research grant that must have a black in a senior position, because of the grantor's preferences or the topic of the research. A brand new sociology PhD from a top school, he is hired for much more than the salary he could make as an assistant professor. There are not enough well-trained black sociologists to go around. Given his role on the project, he is not expected to prepare questionnaire items, or wrestle with computer printouts, or even write the first drafts of the analysis. He is given people to do all that for him. He is not forced to serve his apprenticeship, and, unless he has exceptional determination, he forever remains a black with a degree in sociology instead of developing into a sociologist. Black engineers, lawyers, and professionals of all sorts can recount similar tales of hidden cul-de-sacs. As Lazier found, the black in such a position is shortchanged in on-the-job training and eventually falls behind white peers on the slower but more open-ended professional ladder. Whether because of tokenism or for more complicated reasons, the effect is the same: a ceiling on wages over the course of a career. The problem does not, however, negate the importance of the overall gains that blacks have made in the job market. Few would dispute that it is better to be in the position of the black sociologist I have just described than that of his, or her counterpart of 30 years ago, forced to look for a job teaching high school for lack of opportunities in the white world. A job offer for the wrong reasons is incomparably better than no job offer at all. Taken together, the jobs indicators point to a bifurcation within the black community that we will see again on other, non-economic indicators. If we wear blinders that limit our view to employed persons, blacks made certain types of progress, occasionally quite remarkable progress, from 1960 to 1980. But we know also that the same period saw large-scale reductions in labor force participation, and especially in the 1970s, increases in black unemployment. The result is what Martin Kilson has called a pulling away process, in which a large segment of the black population is effectively tapping white middle-class resources for upward mobility, and another large segment is becoming mired in intergenerational poverty. The data also provide an antidote to a needlessly pessimistic view of black economic progress. For many years prior to the period we are examining, blacks who tried to take the middle-class route to prosperity education found themselves penalized for their efforts with greater discrimination. The 1950s saw a crucial shift in that relationship as black returns to education surpassed those of whites. The basis for eliminating income inequality for blacks and whites of similar credentials had been established. But rewards for possessing credentials are the mirror image of penalties for failing to possess them. The persons driving the rising unemployment rates and the falling labor participation rates were not black electrical engineers, or skilled black craftsmen, or even unskilled youngsters with a solid high school education. They were, for the most part, the labor market's analog to the displaced person, without education, without skills that the job market could use. To reap the higher returns to education, it is necessary to become educated, and during the 1960s and 1970s, fewer and fewer seemed to do so. We turn now to that story. Summary of the federal effort. The core legislation was Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which forbade discrimination in hiring, promotion, firing, transfer, training, and pay among all employers, employment agencies, and labor unions engaged in industry affecting commerce. In 1972, an amendment to the Act extended its provisions to include any business employing more than 15 workers and to employees of state and local governments and educational institutions. The initial objective was to give everyone an equal shot at a job. Affirmative action, destined to be one of the most highly charged legacies of the Great Society, took that objective one step further. The disadvantaged were to be given something more than just an equal chance. They were also to be given a leg up. It was a sensible and just response to a history of exploitation, in the view of its advocates, race discrimination in reverse, according to the critics. It began in September 1965 with the signing of Executive Order 11,246, which enjoined government contractors and others receiving government funds to take concrete measures to promote hiring of blacks and other minorities. These steps to assist the discriminated against individual looking for a job were supplemented by other programs less well known to assist the minority businessman. Section 8A of the Small Business Act, for example, provided that a portion of all government contracts be reserved for minority-owned firms. Such contracts, known as minority set-asides, were to encourage the formation and survival of enterprises owned by disadvantaged persons. The influence of these efforts was slower in coming than a literal reading of the laws might suggest. For example, the federal government did not revoke a contract for non-compliance with Executive Order 11,246 until 1971, 6 years after the order was signed. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission established by the 1964 Act had no enforcement powers until 1972. Teeth began to be put into the equal opportunity and affirmative action provisions in the late 1960s as the EEOC, acting as amicus curiae in civil suits, achieved a number of successes in getting its view of the laws accepted by the courts. In 1968 and 1969, the courts ruled against seniority systems that had the effect of perpetuating racial discrimination in advancement and job security. In 1970, a federal court ruled that specific goals and timetables, quotas of a sort, though the word quota was avoided, were no more or less than a means for implementation of the affirmative action obligations of Executive Order 11,246. The pivotal case, however, came in 1971, in the form of Griggs versus Duke Power. Could an employer impose minimum credentials as a prerequisite for employment? A unanimous Supreme Court said no, not unless the credential can be demonstrated to be significantly related to successful job performance. Even if a hiring practice were fair in form, and even if there were no discriminatory intent, it was prescribed if, in the court's words, it acted as a built-in headwind for minority groups. Congress has placed on the employer, the court held, the burden of showing that any given requirement must have a manifest relationship to the employment in question. Griggs was followed by other major cases, but between 1968 and 1972, the basic guidelines had been established. Thereafter, the EEOC could take enforcement action on its own, and the breadth of the requirements for affirmative action and non-discrimination in job practices was considerable. The influence was more pervasive than a count of court convictions indicates. A business that relied on the federal government for its income, or a substantial portion of its income, could find itself in big trouble even if non-compliance was only being investigated. A market developed for persons who were good at writing affirmative action plans and certifications of compliance. In some of the most basic ways that were intended by the regulations, behavior did change. Job notices were more widely and carefully advertised in places where blacks were more likely to see them, such as placement offices of black universities. Records were kept on the race of persons interviewed for a job. Personnel directors fretted when too few of the underrepresented minority were interviewed, and they fretted even more when many were interviewed but few were hired. Whatever the numbers might say about the effects on actual jobs, employers in the 1970s were conscious of racial hiring practices to a degree that was unheard of in the 1950s. For more details on the chronology, see Phyllis O. Wallace, A Decade of Policy Developments in Equal Opportunities in Employment and Housing, in Robert H. Haveman, ed. A Decade of Federal Anti-Poverty Programs, Achievements, Failures, and Lessons, pp. 329-59. See also Nathan Glazer, Affirmative Discrimination, Ethnic Inequality and Public Policy on the General Issue of Affirmative